If you look at the period between 1977 and the year 2000, India's entire political world was basically torn down and then built back up from scratch. It was a really chaotic time for sure, but also one of incredible change. So today, we're going to unpack how these decades fractured an old system and forged the complex, multi-party democracy we see in India now. This timeline right here, it's like a roadmap of political earthquakes. Seriously. From the end of the emergency to the demolition of the Babri Masjid, every single one of these events sent shockwaves through the system. I mean, they didn't just tweak things, they permanently changed India's path, transforming it from a country run by one party into something way more fragmented, and maybe, in a lot of ways, more representative of its people. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We're looking at 5 huge shifts. First, the end of one-party rule. Then, the explosion of regional power. After that, we'll get into the new social and religious fault lines that appeared. Fourth, a total rewrite of the economy. And finally, how all of this led to something new, the age of coalition governments. So where does this all kick off? Well, for decades, Indian politics basically meant one thing, the Congress Party. But in 1977, right after that really controversial period called the emergency, that solid foundation cracked for the very first time. When they finally held elections again, the result was just stunning. This coalition of opposition groups, the Janata Party, actually won. And look, this was way more than just a new party taking over. It was the end of what was pretty much a single-party democracy. It was the first big sign that Indian voters were ready for something else. What that election really did was open the floodgates. It proved that other parties could not only exist, but they could actually win. And that created a truly competitive political system for the first time, making room for all these new voices, representing farmers, different castes, regional interests, to finally step up and demand their piece of the pie. And you can imagine, right? When the center weakens, things start happening on the edges. That crack in New Delhi sent ripples all across the country. Powerful movements started popping up, especially in states like Assam and Punjab, all demanding more control. Power was literally moving away from the center. But these movements had really different flavors. In Assam, it was mainly a movement against people they called outsiders, driven by a real fear that local culture and jobs were at risk. But in Punjab, the Akali Dal's demands were more political. They were focused on getting more autonomy for the state and changing its whole relationship with the central government. But the situation in Punjab, it just tragically spiraled out of control. The demands for autonomy escalated into a period of really intense violence. This timeline here shows that dark path, leading to the Indian army storming the Golden Temple, then the assassination of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi by her own bodyguards, and the awful anti-Sikh riots that followed. It was a national trauma that left some deep, deep scars. Okay, so while all this regional stuff is heating up, 2 other huge forces are starting to bubble up and reshape Indian society from the inside out: caste and religion. And these new fault lines would basically define the political fights of the 80s and 90s. 27%. Just let that number sink in for a second. What on earth could this be about? Well, in 1990, this number became one of the most explosive, most consequential figures in modern Indian history. This was the slice of government jobs that was reserved for what's known as the other backward classes, or OBCs, this huge group of castes that were seen as socially and educationally disadvantaged. When the government actually implemented this recommendation in 1990, it set off massive protests. But the political impact? It was even bigger. It made caste a central issue for winning elections, and you saw the rise of powerful parties built almost entirely on caste identity. At the very same time, another massive movement was building, but this one was centered on religion. It started with a debate over a court case on Muslim personal law, and then it grew into a huge campaign to build a temple where the Babri Masjid stood in Ayodhya. This idea of political Hinduism, or Hindutva, became an incredibly powerful force. The campaign, with its famous nationwide chariot procession, created deep divisions and ultimately ended with the mosque's demolition in 1992. So picture this. You've got all this social and political chaos happening, and right in the middle of it all, India's economy just hits a brick wall. And the crisis that followed forced the country to just throw out its old economic playbook and write a brand new one. So in 1991, India was on the brink of going broke. It was facing this massive financial crisis. And so it did a complete U-turn. It launched a series of radical reforms called economic liberalization, basically moving away from decades of a state-controlled economy toward one that was open to the world and driven by the market. This was a seismic shift. So how did it all go down? Well, first, the country nearly defaulted on its international loans, which forced the government to act. The response? They threw open the doors to foreign and private companies. And then they started tearing down that super complex bureaucratic system of licenses and regulations, people called it the license Raj, that had choked Indian industry for years. This wasn't just a small policy change, it was a total change in philosophy that would change India's cities, its middle class, and its place in the world forever. So, you take all these pieces we've talked about, regionalism, caste politics, religious movements, a whole new economy, what happens when you throw them all together? Well, you get the absolute end of one-party rule, and you get the beginning of a messy, complicated, but totally new way of doing politics. I mean, think about it for a second. With all these powerful new parties, some based on region, some on caste, some on religion, the math just didn't work anymore for one single party to rule them all. Getting a majority on your own became pretty much impossible. Suddenly, compromise and making alliances weren't just options. They were the only way you could actually govern. And you can see it right here. Just look at this table from 1989 onwards. It's like a revolving door of prime ministers and governments, often patched together from dozens of parties that didn't even agree with each other. This constant instability and these short-lived governments really became the defining feature of politics in the 1990s. And, the turbulence of this era left some really deep wounds. In 2005, years later, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh stood up in Parliament and formally apologized for the anti-Sikh riots of 1984. His words, "I bow my head in shame," were this incredibly powerful moment, admitting the state had failed and reflecting on one of the absolute darkest chapters of this whole period. So, to wrap this all up, that whole period from 1977 to 2000 was nothing less than a complete remaking of India's political identity. It was a messy, often violent process of breaking apart that, in the end, reforged the nation. It went from being a top-down single-party state to the much more decentralized, diverse, and multipolar democracy it is today. So, if you're going to remember anything, remember these 4 things. First, the old political system fractured, and one-party dominance was over. Second, this opened the door for all kinds of new voices, regional, caste, religious, to come to the forefront. Third, the economy was completely reforged. And finally, all of this meant that coalition politics became the new normal, the only way to play the game. And that really leaves us with a big question to think about. This entire period was a massive stress test for Indian democracy. It pushed it right to its limits. So when we look back at all the conflict and all the compromises, what does it tell us about the challenges and the incredible resilience of the world's largest democracy as it keeps changing today?